We just uploaded this data about a week ago, did a real quick QA on the data and got it into some graphs that we can talk about real briefly. But the exciting part here, the part I'm really overwhelmed by, is that we have data. We're celebrating that we have data from these 3 stations, and it's just the beginning. But I do want to peek at these graphs really quickly. What you're looking at here is data from May 20th on the bottom here through June 7th, so about a 3-week period, ending just about a week ago. We are looking at temperature in this graph, and we're looking at hourly data from all 3 stations. The 3 different colored lines you see represent data from the different stations. The dark blue is our original station in Yarmouth. The light blue is our station to the east in Harpswell, and finally the green line represents data, in this case temperature data, from our station in Portland Harbor. And I'm just going to show a few of these and be pretty quick with it. There'll be other events where we can really dig into this data, and I'm very excited to do so. But just very briefly, in looking at the data, what I want to look at are similarities in data. And when we step back and look at long-term trends over time, which is what we're going to eventually be doing, we want to see some similarities in the pattern. And we certainly see that here, but also differences between locations that are short-term. So looking at it through that lens, we definitely see a similarity in the pattern of temperature over time. It's getting warmer here in that last part of this graph. We can point out differences as well. Portland Harbor seems to be colder than the other 2 sites, certainly early on, and then later in the data set, this quick 3-week data set. And Harpswell seems to have the colder water here in the middle. And I want to point out that something certainly seems to have occurred here in the middle of this 3-week period. And in fact, this occurred over Memorial Day weekend. And if you remember, although the weather was not memorable really, we had a huge storm during this time. Big, heavy rainfall, big winds, colder than I would have expected temperatures. And you can certainly see those storms impacting the temperature, at least here at these 3 stations in Casco Bay. And for whatever reason, Harpswell became the colder site between those 3 during that time. So as I flip through these next few graphs, and again, very quickly, keep in mind this storm, this big wet weather event added a lot of fresh water to the bay during this period in time. So moving from this temperature graph to salinity, set up the same way, May 20 through June 7th, moving through time, data, hourly data from all 3 stations. We're just looking at salinity now. And what really jumps out here is this drop in salinity in the middle of the graph, and we had all that fresh water from those storms. Certainly there are differences in the salinity data, salinity being a measure of the saltiness of the water, how salty the bay is. Adding a lot of fresh water will change how much salinity you have. I'm used to seeing data from our Yarmouth station, that dark blue line, and there's not a lot of change. It's generally a very consistent site, unless you get a big freshwater event like the one we had over Memorial Day weekend. These 2 new sites seem to have a lot of peaks and valleys, differences, in this case because of the tide and a lot of riverine influence. But really the takeaway here is just that the big drop off in salinity as you added all that fresh water from those rain events. And noticeably, how it was very pronounced in Harpswell and in Yarmouth, and then they both rebounded pretty quickly. Portland Harbor took a little longer for that freshwater influence to be felt, and certainly took a little longer in recovering back to where it is without that big rain event. So again, these are just kind of quick hits. I am just looking at this data now. There's been no real analysis of it. You're seeing it as we're seeing it. But moving forward, pH, a measure of the acidity of the water in the bay. And again, those 2 takeaways, very similar patterns between all 3 stations, but the green line here from Portland Harbor, that pH data seems to be lower, indicating that it's a bit more acidic than these other 2 stations. For whatever reason, it is a more urban area with more nutrient runoff. We'll see. We're certainly going to be collecting a lot more data, and we'll have a lot more to look at. But that's the quick takeaway here, is that pH in Portland Harbor seems to be lower, a little more acidic conditions there. But it's nice to see that pattern is the similar dropping off early on, then kind of becoming more level this last week between all three stations. And just a couple more really brief looks at the data. This is chlorophyll. This is a measure of phytoplankton in the water, algae in the water. And while the data is very similar toward the second half of our data set here, we seem to have a lot more algae in the water in Portland Harbor. Again, the green line being Portland Harbor, higher amounts of chlorophyll, higher amounts of phytoplankton, a bloom in the water. Again, perhaps it's a more nutrient-loaded area. Perhaps this is what we're going to see. Again, it's just very, very exciting that we have a snippet of data to look at. We'll know a lot more. We'll understand a lot more as we move forward over this next year, next 5 years, next 10 years. But